See, we've spoken before about, as a New York resident, this pops into my head anytime I think about, like, what I would do if someone came to my door and needed help, or, like, on the street needed help. I'm like,
Here's my phone.
Exactly. There's a payphone on the block.
Yeah, like, here's a quarter, make a phone. No, people knock on the door here, and we literally peek out the blinds to be like, is it someone we know?
You think Jesus is going to save you?
I was just thinking the other day about how we just automatically lock our doors, and how that was an unusual thing to do like 30 years ago.
Oh shit, Hayden's pregnant.
I was pregnant with Violet. I was sick all the time for 2 months straight.
Someone needs to tell her that every pregnancy is different. She is reading way too far into this.
Something was wrong after what you went through.
You know, it also would be kind of interesting to maybe learn more about the number of horror films that follow a miscarriage. Like the number of stories, or include a miscarriage, and what that represents, both in this show and, like, in general.
Yeah. There's a lot of pregnancy and just generally baby horror in the show. Not just this season, in, like, multiple seasons. But yeah, a miscarriage. I mean, that even shows up in Roanoke. That's in the first episode. That's why Shelby, I hate this.
I think I would make a different choice. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a lose-lose situation.
Didn't have that fear before, but I certainly do now.
How many times have you had this dream?
Like 10.
So confident in his ghost swimmers.
It's not the house. Like, when are one of you going to realize what's going on?
What are you spelling, Constance? Her room?
Yes, Ben is bad, we know. Home invasion is my top fear, far and away.
The theme of all dysfunction funneling from the matriarch.
It's a filthy goddamn horror show.
Welcome to It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show. This is my best friend, Nathan Skethway. Probably one of the most creative people I've ever met in my whole life.
Oh, and this is my heart and soul, Monique Questorf, who is probably one of the most put together people that I've ever met in my entire life.
Setting the bar really high, okay?
So, if you didn't join us last week, basically what we're doing is each week we are going to rewatch an episode of American Horror Story, starting with the first season, Murder House. And from that, we're going to pick 2 topics, 1 per person, inspired by something that we saw in the episode, by something it made us think about, whatever. And the 2 of us are going to teach each other and you some facts about those topics. Sometimes we may ramble a bit, we may get a little off topic, but what we can always promise is that you're going to learn something spooky and that it'll be related to American Horror Story in some way.
Nathan and I are best friends who bonded primarily over horror, especially American Horror Story, but we've taken many, many frightful journeys through many large horror franchises and also small horror films as well. And that is something that we've always been able to have very interesting, insightful, deep conversations about together. And so Nathan and I will watch a movie that is connected to our topic, that was inspired by the episode of American Horror Story that we watched. And so we'll talk about that now.
This week, I chose to watch the sequel to The Strangers, The Strangers Pray at Night, which I decided because this week's episode is titled Home Invasion and is about home invasion, which, as I said earlier, is my top fear. It paralyzes me, the thought of somebody breaking into my home in the middle of the night. And I remember you and I actually watched the first Strangers together back in college, and it wrecked me. It was a deeply stressful experience. And I had been meaning to watch the new one, and I just hadn't gotten around to it. But I finally watched it, and let me tell you, this movie did not come to play. The first one's not exactly playing around either, but it's just the couple. So they I mean, spoiler alert, they don't make it. But if you haven't seen The Strangers, they spend the majority of the time just trying to get away from the three intruders, but the stakes were higher much faster this time. It's a family, and they're on the way to take the daughter to a boarding school because she has behavioral issues. So that's sort of where the tension and the pre-existing issues for the family come in. And they go to this trailer park that their relatives own, and they stay in, they check into a trailer for the night, and that's when the three intruders show up and start terrorizing them. But it was interesting because not only is it home invasion of an unfamiliar home, it was a home that wasn't theirs, and then the rest of the trailer park was completely abandoned, so they moved throughout the entire thing, which is not what I was expecting from the trailer. The trailer made it look like it was just set at like one motel or something like that, but they're in this huge trailer park with all these different empty trailers, with woods, all these roads, and like you have no idea where these three people could be at any time, even more so than the first movie where they're just hanging around the house, because there's a significant portion of the movie where most of the family is split up, and you have no idea if they're gonna run into one of the people or not, and neither do they. They're all just running blindly through the dark, and the whole time I'm like, they could be anywhere. Get somewhere that you can hide and stay there.
That whole scenario of like, let alone just being in an unfamiliar place, right? That's a nightmare. That is, I mean, if you are anxious people, as Nathan and I are, if you've just saturated yourself in enough horror, as Nathan and I have, we're just very hypervigilant to our surroundings, to our level of safety. So, I mean, I know whenever I go to a new place, I scour every nook and cranny, I open every door, and not to be like, is someone here, but I'm just like, I gotta know what all these spaces are like, just because I need to. Because it's such a high level fear of something awful happening in a place where you already feel unsettled. But for there to be an entire empty trailer park, if the strangers knew the area better than the family, that would be like a whole other level of extreme fear and anxiety of that's a no-win situation for that family.
Exactly. If you haven't seen the second Strangers movie, especially if you enjoyed the first, I can solidly recommend it. It is a nightmare for anybody who is like me and is afraid of home invasion. And I gotta be honest, I'm not even sure where that fear stems from. It's so clear in my mind. It's such an intense fear, but it's not like I've ever had any sort of traumatic experience with a home invasion. But yeah, that ever since I was a little kid, that has always haunted me, that idea. And those are the horror movies that I tend to find the most upsetting to me too. I can deal with, I mean, a ghost movie will definitely creep me out, but these are the type of movies that stick with me and that quite literally keep me up at night. I had a little bit of trouble going to bed after I watched The Strangers, I'm not gonna lie.
Well, and I've never had an experience where, my home was invaded or could have been invaded, but I have distinct memories of being a young child. Like, we grew up in the time of like oversaturated news, right? Mm-hmm. Like just hearing horrific things happening to other people in different communities. I mean, that impacts a young brain to be like, oh, this could happen in real life, or this is happening to other people. We talk a lot about, especially when we're watching American Horror Story, we talk a lot about how your door is unlocked, your door is open, you're letting strangers in. Like, there's just things that we would never ever do because we've grown up in this world where we have become well aware that there are bad things happening all over the world.
I do enjoy movies that feature home invasion, but they are the ones that freak me out the most. So for this week, that is the topic that I decided to delve into was home invasion, especially in the horror film genre specifically. So from doing some research, the earliest instance I can find of a movie that features home invasion was a film called The Lonely Villa. It was a short film created in 1909, so early as fuck in terms of the timeline of film history, especially for horror films. That was pretty big for the time, but it features a wife and kids who are home alone, and thieves break into the house. They barricade themselves in a room, and at the end, the father realizes what's going on and dashes home to save the day. Which I thought was kind of interesting, because this particular episode of American Horror Story turns that right on its head by having Ben, the father figure, be entirely out of commission and no help at all during the entire experience, and then he doesn't show up until the end when Vivian and Violet have taken on that savior role for themselves.
Yeah, when the damage has already been done.
Exactly. But yeah, so The Lonely Villa starts us off with home invasion in horror movies. Shows up in a couple other films, notably Dial M for Murder, which is a really great film by Alfred Hitchcock from 1954. That one features a wife who is having an affair, and the husband finds out, so he hires a killer to break in while she's home alone to kill her. But then after that, we get Black Christmas in 1974. But that one features a sorority house that is stalked by an intruder on Christmas. And it's notable not only for hugely impacting John Carpenter's Halloween, which came out later that decade, and also similarly to Prey at Night, kind of turns the home invasion thing on its head by making it an entire neighborhood. But it's known for being the first film to use and make famous the line/trope, "The caller is in the house, the calls are coming from inside the house." That's a very famous line. Was later fully expanded into its own horror movie in 1979 with When a Stranger Calls, and that one features a babysitter who is terrorized by an intruder who is calling her and then turns out to be inside the house, which is also the case with Black Christmas, that obviously the killer turns out to have been in the house the entire time. But the interesting thing that I found is that both of these films are based on an urban legend. The urban legend is referred to as The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. Stop me if you've heard this one, but babysitter's caring for some kids, gets a call from a mysterious caller saying, "Have you checked the children?" She passes it off as nothing, but keeps getting these harassing calls throughout the night, and eventually calls the police. They say they're going to trace the call, and when they call her back, they let her know the calls are coming from inside the house. The killer is in the house. And interestingly enough, this urban legend is commonly attributed to a real-life murder. This happened in 1950. This was the murder of Janet Chrisman, who was a 13-year-old babysitter in Columbia, Missouri.
Now, before I go on, I want to just take a moment to address the fact that we do delve into some dark topics and real-life stories here on the show, especially murders. But for particularly sensitive topics, we will take a moment to warn listeners of, potential triggers in the story that we're telling. So this is just a quick warning that while the following story does briefly allude to rape, we're not going to go too far into those details.
So, it's nighttime, it's the middle of winter. Janet is babysitting for Ed and Anne Romack. She's watching their 3-year-old son Gregory. It's in the middle of a winter storm. There's rain and sleet. And the Romacks are headed to a friend's house to play cards. So, at around 10:35 that night, the police get a call from the Romack house. And the officer who answers says that he hears horrifying screams and then just the words, "Come quick." And then that's the end of the call. But because it's the 1950s, they weren't able to find out where it was coming from. They just had to hope that she called back. So they couldn't do anything.
Wow.
So then later that night, at 1:15, the Romacks leave their friend's house. They return home at 1:35. They find that the porch light is on, the blinds are open, and the front door is unlocked, which shouldn't be the case because Janet knows better. She's babysat for them before. And when they go in, they find Janet in the living room. She's been raped. She's been hit in the head with a blunt instrument. She's been stabbed with a mechanical pencil. And she's been strangled with a cord from an electric iron. But based on the scene, the police are able to see that she put up a huge fight. She definitely put up a struggle with her killer. And during all of this, including when they got home, 3-year-old Gregory is asleep upstairs. He slept through the entire thing. He had no idea what was going on.
Now Gregory gets to grow up and be like, my babysitter was murdered when I was a child while she was watching me.
Exactly. That case remains unsolved to this day. They never found out who did it. It was one of a string of similar crimes that was going on in the time at the area, but they were never able to find out who killed Janet Christman. So from that, over the years, the details, as often happens, the details get skewed, an urban legend is formed, and by the 70s, we have full-fledged horror movies based on this idea. It's also interesting, specifically from a standpoint with this season, that Murder House is taking place in Los Angeles, because the next decade, in the 1980s, we have Richard Ramirez, who is stalking the Los Angeles area. For our listeners, I'm not sure how much most of you know about Richard Ramirez. There are other podcasts for that, but the basics is that he was a serial killer who stalked LA suburbs in the mid-1980s, and his MO was that he would break into homes in the middle of the night and murder people in their beds. He never had much of a motive for the people that he chose. It was mostly just random killings, which is really kind of the ultimate example of the nightmare of home invasion. Is they're not even looking for anything. They don't want anything from you. They just want to do harm, which I think is a huge reason that the Strangers movies are so fucking upsetting. Is there's that line in the first one where they say, "Why are you doing this?" and they just say, "Because you were home." And that terrifies me to no end, and I think that's what messes with me so much about home invasion, is the possibility that maybe there's nothing you can do because there's nothing that they actually want besides to hurt you. So this kind of just begs the question, what is it about home invasion that makes it so scary? Besides the obvious, what is it about home invasion that terrifies people so much? And like I said, besides the obvious, and that home is meant to be a safe place that signifies security, it signifies family bonds, and the entire event of a home invasion completely turns that on its head. It transforms your home from a refuge and the place that you seek for safety to a danger situation. It makes it into an unfamiliar place, and it makes it so there's sort of a sense of like, if you're at home, you're safe, you can defend your home, but if the person who is meaning you harm is in your home and is using that against you, it completely warps our sense of security. Where do you go? How do you seek safety at that point?
Yeah, home is supposed to be the safest place for everybody.
I want to end with these two quotes that I found, both from Sophie Hannah of The Telegraph in a 2017 article that she published about home invasion in horror films and what makes it so scary. And she says, "I once read an interesting analysis of how we respond to strangers. If a person grows up feeling safe and loved in his or her family, then the stranger is more likely to be perceived as a potential threat. Whereas if your family is unstable or dangerous, you're more likely to trust strangers and see them as potential rescuers." So yeah, that kind of speaks to maybe what might be driving some of these characters, and also just people in real life, to make that decision, to decide, not necessarily, I don't even know if they're really thinking, can I trust this person? But I think it's more of like a gut reaction that takes place at first of whether or not you initially trust somebody, even be it a stranger. And the other quote that I found, which speaks a bit to specifically why home invasion terrifies us so much, both in movies and real life. And that's also from Sophie Hannah of The Telegraph. She says, The horror is magnified when we realize what we should be afraid of is our own flawed judgment. Not only might this violent stranger kill us, but we might be the ones ultimately responsible for our own gruesome fate. Which I had never considered before is that frustration of when you're screaming at the screen, saying, why would you do that? You're also thinking to yourself, fuck, what if I had done that in that case? Like, I'm sitting here mad at this person because it feels like it's their fault that they're in their situation, but I can't guarantee that I would react any differently, and then that's the exact same situation I would find myself in.
The therapist in me cannot help but point out that the person who's really at fault in this situation is the attacker, the stranger,
well, yes.
the aggressor.
Yes, of course.
But I mean, it's so much easier to say that than to actually put that in action. If more people thought about how their judgment may be flawed, instead of just blindly believing that they are right about everything all the time and they have nothing left to learn, the world would be a completely and totally different place.
Fair enough.
But I do think that there is, that the first quote by Sophie Hannah that you read is really, really interesting to me. I think it's very telling of our current time. I think that we had a different perception of society and strangers, 50 years ago. But even if you look at like the attachment of children, if a child, like if a toddler is not put off by a stranger and will greet a stranger like they know them, that is incredibly dangerous. And that does tell you a lot about the kind of attachment they have to their own parents. Wow. Well, I'm thoroughly anxious. Thoroughly anxious.
You're welcome.
Just having to process.
Do you think maybe we should take a quick commercial break to process and to tone down the anxiety? All right, everybody, we will be right back after this brief break.
For our podcast, in lieu of a sponsorship, we have decided to highlight a charity that is making an impact in the world or even in our individual communities or our individual lives. The organization that I have chosen to highlight this week is the All That We Can Save project. If you haven't noticed, our planet is dying. It is on fire. It is shriveling up, and there is very little that is being done to keep our planet sustainable for generations to come. But the thing about All That We Can Save that is extra special to me as a female-bodied person is that this is a woman-led organization. There are a couple different ways that you can support the organization. There is an anthology called All That We Can Save that is characteristically feminine and more faithfully feminist, rooted in compassion, connection, creativity, and collaboration. You can also donate directly to the organization at allwecansave.earth/donate. All right, welcome back to It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show. The movie that I would like to talk about this week is The Babadook, directed by Jennifer Kent. Came out in 2014. I have seen this movie before, but I watched it for the purpose of this episode through like the lens of the research that I had done for this episode, specifically looking at maternal horror. And there were a few moments that really stood out to me more impactfully than the first time I had watched it. The first time you sit down and watch a horror film, it's like, this is a spooky, I want to be scared, like you're just there for the experience. And as with, most things that you watch for a second or a third or a 10th time, you're looking more for patterns, for themes, for connections, for any like movements that are happening in the background. I know one thing that I kind of kept repeating to myself when Samuel, the little boy, looks at his mom and says, "I'll protect you if you protect me." I was like, damn.
Oh, wow. I don't remember that at all. I've only seen this movie one time, but I don't remember that at all. That's kind of beautiful.
this, I mean,
And also
this poor,
deeply sad.
it is deeply, deeply sad. I mean, it's kind of, I will also say it's difficult for me, especially as I'm kind of coming through this lens of mental health. It's hard for me not to see kind of the undertones of what this like is theatrically playing out. You know, the movie is obviously using visuals and effects to represent things that are actually going on in people's minds and people's homes. The other part that really stood out to me in the actual book, you know, she goes through the process of destroying this book so many times. You know, she puts it on a shelf, she throws it away, she rips it up, she burns it. And there's this one time where it was returned to her with more of the pages filled out. And it basically said, like, the more you deny me, the stronger I get. And I was like, oh, this is a perfect metaphor for mental health, right? Like, this, all in all, this is a story of a grieving mother. She lost her husband the day that her son was born. You know, there's that bottled resentment. And she even said later in the movie, when she's possessed by the Babadook, she says to her son, "I wish you died and not your father," basically. It was tough to watch outside of the realm of entertainment, of just kind of looking at it as like this intense case study of grief and motherhood. The ending is always still so interesting to me. The Babadook is in the basement and the mother feeds it.
I mean, you were saying that the movie is kind of a huge meditation on grief, and a lot of people have theorized that the Babadook is simply meant to symbolize her grief. So I think the takeaway that I always took from the ending is that she has learned to live with her grief, that it's not going to be a situation of making it go away or ignoring it. You have to acknowledge it. You don't live in it. You don't invite it to live in the main rooms in your house, but you keep it somewhere that you know where it is, and you tend to it and you take care of yourself.
Right. And that's exactly how I feel about the ending too, especially kind of looking at it this time around from this perspective of mental health and motherhood. I hate the sound of the Babadook. I hate that itchy, scratchy, like throat sound.
It's like a little bit like The Grudge.
Yeah. I hate it. I hate it so much. The Babadook does really encapsulate the perspective that I've taken from Home Invasion, episode 2 of season 1 of American Horror Story. You know, Constance has a moment where she's in the kitchen. I think she's trying to force feed Vivian a cupcake filled with Epicac. No, she wants to give it to Violet. And she's talking about how all of these, I think she even refers to her children, not kindly. Does she call them monsters in this scene? You know, she basically makes a comment saying, like, I should have stopped after my first child, and all the rest of them are monsters. And just like this intense responsibility that Constance was taking, it's just so intriguing to me to kind of think more about this maternal horror, or this, you know, malevolent matriarch. And this is a widespread topic. I mean, and there's so many different ways that it can be looked at and understood. The perspective I'm taking today is specifically like a biological, like maternal horror, a mother raising a child, in all the ways that relationship can be demonized and kind of turned into horror in and of itself. But there are other kind of heavy hitters that I wouldn't be talking about today. I think about Suspiria, 2018 film directed by Luca Guadagnino, and Hereditary, also a 2018 film written and directed by Ari Aster, where there is a matriarch or a mother that is spawning some dark energy. But I am looking more at the simplistic relationship today. I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunities. I mean, I just even think about Hotel.
Oh boy.
in that aspect. But just for today, just focusing on dysfunctional or destructive mothers in the horror genre. So mothers become the source of danger when they fail to protect their child. Either they are the ones actively harming their child, or they are the ones who are incapable of preventing other sources, other bad things or bad people from harming their child, or defy the expectations of their role as a mother and damage their child in that way. Usually when we see this trope, especially when we've seen it, I saw it watching the Babadook, these mothers, the challenge really begins when they start to isolate themselves, when they begin to be socially distant, and aren't able to trust the people around them, ultimately becoming paranoid, anxious, and suspicious of the world that they live in. The dysfunction in direct relation to the child can either be a lack of affection toward the child, or it can be obsessively overperforming the role of a mother. The horror really comes from, it's kind of, Nathan, what you were talking about in your topic of the week. The horror comes from the mother, who is supposed to be this symbol of stability, becoming unstable, becoming irrational, becoming violent. That safe place, that safe person is no longer safe.
And that's got to be like a deep one too, because that's the first bond that you form. For a lot of people, I should say, that you form a bond with your mother. So it makes sense that is so terrifying in a horror sense, because it's a huge inversion of the most basic, what it's supposed to be, the most basic, safe, nurturing relationship that you have.
Well, I mean, you're right. Like, even like fetuses, unborn babies can recognize the voice of their mothers. So, and similar to your topic, violent parents, violent mothers are very real. It's a real life thing. It's a real life occurrence, and I think that makes it difficult too to kind of think about how we aren't necessarily able to separate ourselves from that when we think about that horror genre. But within the genre, there are a few different perspectives to take when looking at like a dysfunctional mother and maternal horror, or why a mother becomes dysfunctional. First, it's the social pressures of being a mother, or the expectations of motherhood. The notion of idealized motherhood, of being the perfect mother, of being able to do it all. It's unstable in and of itself. In movies and unfortunately in reality, mothers are imperfect people, but still hold to such a high standard. Coupled with this idea that mothers are responsible for raising their children to be accepted, to be socially acceptable by societal standards. And when that does not happen, when children don't thrive, who is blamed but the mother? And when we idealize this idea of a good mother, it creates the opposite. It creates this entity then of a bad mother. A lot of times in horror films, if there is this dichotomy between a good mother and bad mother, it usually is accompanied with an absent father, right? Because then the mother becomes the sole provider. She becomes the sole caretaker. All the responsibility funnels to her. We even see that in American Horror Story. Spoiler alert, Constance murders her husband, ultimately making herself a single mother. But then this woman, the mother, is defined solely by her role of being a mother. There's every decision that you make, every financial decision, every personal decision, it's all to raise this child that you are solely responsible for. Then mothers feel enslaved in that role. They can't escape it. Their identity does not exist outside of that role, out of that identity. And in some of these movies, and in some of these real life scenarios, mothers in this situation with these emotions then feel like the only way that they're able to escape this is to rid themselves of their child, to murder the child. In some of these movies that we see that follow this trope, there's a possessiveness that a mother has over their child as well, that causes the child to have an unhealthy relationship with her, obviously, but also with society. I mean, I think about the Babadook. Samuel is peculiar. He is a strange boy. And that, like I said earlier, that reflects on the mother. But it's that relationship that, thinking even about American Horror Story, you know, Constance's possessiveness over her children, I mean, is it explored well enough? I don't know, but definitely could lead to that challenge that, I mean, this, I think about Tate especially. Whether or not Tate is being influenced by the home is another story, but I do think that his unhealthy relationship with his mother does not help much in the way that he wants to express himself, and ultimately does express himself later in the season.
Yeah, there's that that part where he's, I don't know if he's just come out of therapy with Ben, but Constance visits him in the house, and he's talking about the fact that he's been doing therapy, and then he looks at her and says, "Turns out I just hate my mother." And in that moment, you can see it on her face that she knows that he is blaming her for everything that happened, for the fact that he's dead, for what he did while he was alive, all of it.
You know, the other challenging part of absent fathers, you know, even in the stories or the real life scenarios where mothers choose to leave their husbands, it's not that the husband left or the husband died, but a mother is choosing to leave in unhealthy, unsafe situation. Society is not structured in a way that helps mothers raise their children. I mean, we live in a patriarchal society, right? We live in this world that caters to, or we live in a world that it brings a disadvantage to the matriarch. And who is left in that situation but a mother raising the child? And that oppressive system leads to further dysfunction within the mother. The next aspect of what kind of perpetuates this dysfunctional, destructive mother is the abjection of a mother's body and the confinement within a domestic space. And we saw it in the Babadook, and we also saw it in this episode of American Horror Story. This idea of a mother having sexuality. You know, it's not acceptable, right? You know, when a mother is raising a child, or let's face it, when a woman exists in the world, she's not really seen for much outside of her purpose to reproduce, right? That her giving birth to children is her sole purpose in this situation. So if she's not looking to have more children, why would she bother to indulge in her sexuality? But a mother not being able to express her sexuality further suppresses her ability to have an identity outside of her role as a mother, furthering the dysfunction. And then we saw it in the Babadook, and we will see it in many, 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 many ways throughout several episodes of American Horror Story. But, you know, when a mother's or when a woman's body becomes the source of terror because it cannot be understood outside of the patriarchal context. I think of, some examples that were given, but also even some images that I witnessed while I watched my movie this week, menstrual blood, you know, using that as a source of gore, but also like when women are throwing up, when they're like releasing bodily fluids, their body then is becoming a part of the horror and the terror. In some situations too, you know, when we do see a woman or a mother expressing sexuality in horror films or in the horror genre, it is almost always controlled by the husband if the husband is still present, right? It's on his terms. It's when he wants it, for his pleasure only. And you touched on this part so directly when you were talking about your topic this week. With mothers, with maternal horror, where else does the horror typically take place but in the home? Because that is where the relationship exists. So because, you know, home is where the horror takes place and is at the heart of the mother's violence toward her child, it challenges this idea that a child, when they're grown, can always go back to home, where home is safe. You always have a place with your parents. But how, in a situation with Samuel, in a situation with, well, Tate can't leave his home, that's not a safe place. That's not a place you want to return to. You know, you didn't You were not comforted by your mother's love in that situation.
I guess the combined sort of question that we both arrived at this week is what do you do when home is where the horror is instead? Well, with that in mind, I think perhaps it might be time to take these fine people into a twist ending. What do you think?
I think that sounds like a great idea.
All right, twist ending. Here we go. So this week, I am going to bring you some production facts about the Rosenheim Mansion, which is the murder house, the real-life stand-in house for the murder house. Interestingly enough, this is not the first time that the Rosenheim Mansion in LA has been used as a filming location. It was previously used in the Halloween episode Fear Itself of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That was the episode where Buffy visited a frat house and there was a demon that could materialize people's worst fears. So right away, already connecting the house with terror and people's worst fears materialized. But the house itself was built in 1902 by Alfred Rosenheim, who was a German-American architect. He was actually known for designing several amusement parks and roller coasters. And he lived there for most of his life. The house is situated on Billionaire Row, which was at the time the neighborhood of some of the wealthiest families in LA. Some facts about the house: the glass fixtures are actually Tiffany stained glass, which Nora references it later and Marcy references it when they're touring the house. I was pleased that they were not respectful but just conscious of the details of the house when they built that in. Like some of the house's actual history is woven into Murder House's history. It was passed through several owners, including a convent full of Catholic nuns. The house actually served as a convent from 1932 until 1997.
That's 60 years. That's a long time.
60 years of a house full of nuns. Now it's the murder house. But it actually currently contains a world-famous recording and post-production facility for music and film, which I would imagine makes it easier for them to shoot there. But the house itself only features in certain episodes of American Horror Story. Obviously, they use it as the exterior location. Anytime that you see it from the outside, you're seeing the actual house. And during most of the pilot episode, I would imagine with the exception of the twins wrecking the place in the beginning, they're actually filming in the Rosenheim Mansion. And then in this particular episode, in Home Invasion, the scene that opens when the two nurses are murdered in the 60s, that is the actual house. They wanted to keep it intact, so they use the actual house for that. But for the rest of the season, they actually recreated the Rosenheim Mansion's rooms and various parts of its layout on a soundstage. So that way they were able to wreck aspects of it if they needed to. If they needed to get blood on the walls, they didn't have to worry about the fact that they were dealing with a house from 1902. However, I would imagine those sets have since long been dismantled on the 21st Century Fox studio lot. So the murder house scenes that we see in Apocalypse, I believe, are filmed at the actual Rosenheim Mansion, and then this brand new murder house installment that we're getting with American Horror Stories, they're filming at the Rosenheim Mansion. So it continues to get use. The owners have complained a lot about fans showing up. A fence, like a chain link fence, has been erected around the property. They have tried to take a lot of measures to stop people from coming and checking out the house, but it's just so iconic. If I were in LA, I can't say that I wouldn't at least want to drive by it. So I understand, but similarly to the Amityville house, it's been, just for different reasons, it's been difficult for the homeowners to avoid the legacy and the hype that has surrounded the building because of the show.
Well, my twist ending was really influenced by that horrific scene where Constance is interrupted by Adelaide while she's trying to have some sensual experiences with her young boy toy, and she locks her in a closet full of mirrors and punishes her by forcing her to look at herself. So, I thought I would take a broad look at emotional abuse. Coming in hot here with the heavy hitters of real-life mental health. And emotional abuse is defined as harming or breaking down another person's self-esteem in order to achieve a certain goal, usually to gain power over the other person or to cause psychological harm. It can be done through teasing, criticism, insults, terror, isolation, control, and humiliation. A common technique of abusers is accusing the other person of causing their behavior. So I think even in this situation, doesn't Constance say something like, you did this to yourself? You know, like, just think about what you did, where Adelaide was just trying to tell her mother that people were breaking in next door. Some different actions of emotional abuse or ways that you can identify emotional abuse in others or in yourself. Ridiculing someone in front of other people, criticizing or teasing constantly, insulting, manipulating based on lies, threats, indirect phrases, or with silence, never recognizing qualities or merits, using facial or body expressions to scare, never letting the other do what they want to do, opposing to socialize or be with friends and family, showing affection to reward or withholding affection to punish, and focusing only on the defects of the other person.
That's Constance in a nutshell.
Especially with Adelaide, who is the only living child she has left, and she's so stinking mean to her, but she's mean to most people. Is she nice to anyone?
Her hairdresser at the end. She's that monologue with her hairdresser. That's really it. She becomes nice to Vivian, but there are definitely ulterior motives involved there. She just wants her baby. I feel like it would feel rather disingenuous if Constance were openly nice to anybody without an ulterior motive, though. Like, that's so woven into her character. I would just be like, even if she were genuinely trying to be nice, I'd be like, I don't trust you, bitch.
Well, thank you for joining us during this episode of It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show.
If you liked what you heard this episode or last episode, there's a lot more on the way this season, and you can also follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. We also have a YouTube channel where you can listen to full episodes. But otherwise, if you have not watched the second episode of Season 10 of American Horror Story, double feature, this episode is now over for you. It's been great, but you should probably skedaddle if you don't want to get any spoilers.
Join us next week for our next episode of
It's a filthy goddamn horror show.
All right, double feature, episode 2.
I'm a little bit tortured by the fact that this child has taken this pill.
Yeah, I definitely, even in episode, the minute she asked about it in episode 1, I was like, okay, so she's gonna take the pill, but like, the implications of that are horrifying.
Well, the things that we learned in this episode are so tragic with this. I mean, we already talked about like this child's like perfectionistic tendency, and the aftermath of taking this pill is that you are never satisfied with your work again without taking this pill. So she is like 8, 9, 10 years old, and now she will never feel as satisfied with her ordinary life.
And she'll never accomplish anything musically without it. Like, all of her accomplishments from this point forward are going to be based on that. And like, I'm interested to see if they address how can that be fulfilling. Like, yes, you'll be successful, and obviously that's working for Belle Noire and Austin, but they also don't seem like the happiest people in the world, and they're morally corrupt to an extreme degree at this point. So like, what's it gonna do to someone who grows with that from childhood, especially from the age of 8?
I'm really curious about this instinctive compulsion to, because Harry's first instinct was not to suck the blood out of an animal. I wonder if that's a different like manifestation in a child, where it's more instinctual, it's more primitive.
So I think we've both agreed on this at this point. So you think that Doris is gonna find out about the pill and try to take it, but it's not gonna work for her? How heartbreaking.
I think that they've alluded too many times to her, even her own like insecurity kind of being reflected to her from her loved ones of not being good enough. She had a conversation with Harry of her kind of projecting, like, you don't think I'm good enough. You don't think I'm talented. And then, of course, this episode too is Alma. Of course, she's being influenced by the pill, but calling her mother ordinary, and that hurting Doris in a very deep place. Like, it's foreboding, right? Like, it's
rough.
We learned about the nature of these beings and what makes them sustainable and what turns them into the bad ones. And it's like we're gonna have to see someone turn into a bad one, and it's gonna be heart-wrenching.
Yeah, and it'll. I feel like it's gonna be Doris, as much as I don't want it to be, but that speaks a lot to what you talked about in this episode with mother horror.
Yeah, the mother becoming the horror. I feel like that's on the horizon for us in this season. Especially, I know I referenced this in the previous episode, but she's pregnant. Like, there's also that impending, and I will say, like, the image that keeps coming into my mind is, okay, so father and daughter are now both intensely attracted to human blood. Husband, when Harry, when Doris cut her finger, like, couldn't even take a rational moment to be like, it would be really weird if I just sucked the blood out of my wife's finger right now. Like, so I can't even imagine what it will be like when that birthing process starts and the animalistic urges that might be present, and what that means for Doris and baby. It's too much. I'm not excited for that, truthfully.
Some heavy shit going on.
Sarah Paulson killing it
as always. I would like to extend a personal thank you to Ryan Murphy, who is not listening to this, for giving us Macaulay Culkin and Sarah Paulson in not only a scene together, but a killer scene together, an emotional, deep scene together. Like, they both knocked it out of the park. I just met these two characters and I was already so invested.
I'm a 90s kid. I love Macaulay Culkin just being around for this. I don't care. I really wouldn't care what he's doing, but the fact that he's around, and of course he's doing the best, he's doing the most, it truly is just, like you said, that emotional impact is profound. But we also are blessed by the presence of Billie Lourd. She makes an appearance in this episode, and I have a soft spot for Billie Lourd.
Me too. I adore Billie Lourd. It is only partially because Carrie Fisher was her mother. I also just find her incredibly charming and charismatic and just fun to watch in every episode. Having said that, did not enjoy watching her file a man's teeth down. The sound designer deserves an award and also a slap in the face, because that hurt me to have to listen to. That was
would not recommend. Do not do this at home. It's such an intriguing concept here, where it's truly any artistic ability can be enhanced. Mm-hmm. So what are the bounds? I think of, like, cake decorating.
Right? Can you imagine?
Where
you're just
where
like
are the limits?
Doing the fucking cake for the royal wedding after you take the pill.
Such an intriguing concept. So one of the things I love the most about American Horror Story is the concepts that are created and how well flushed out those concepts are within these worlds. It would be really interesting to see in the American Horror Story universe, are these people taking black pills?
I could see there being a world where by the end of this we find out that
every famous
person this is how they've gotten their success. That would be maybe a little heavy-handed, but
that'd be really interesting. It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is created by Monique Quistorf and Nathan Skethway. Nathan also edits and mixes our show.
To find out about the music used in this episode, check out our website at filthygdhorrorshow.com. It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is a podcast created by American Horror Story fans and is in no way affiliated with the show.